Oh, meeting's being live streamed. Wonderful. Looks like we should be live now.
Okay, yeah, certainly saying live on my screen. I must say it is a whole lot more relaxing having your capable hands here, Rachel, keeping this working.
Just double check the feed on Facebook. Yeah, for those of you watching, getting Zoom to translate into Facebook live stream is really, really difficult. And we've had a few issues on the way, but I think for the third and final webinar that we're actually here.
What do you mean final?
Oh, number 3 of the 3.
Quite right.
But I'm sure Simon wants to get us back presenting to parents in the future.
No, it's been, small beginnings, but that's how all good things start. And it's been really good hearing from parents and trying to get some of these messages through, because you guys can make quite a big difference.
Mm-hmm. Cool. All right, looks like we've got some people online now, so let's just crack into it.
Okay, so will it be recording automatically from when we started? Yep. Okay, welcome everybody. Are you sure, Rachel? Mine actually says start webinar on my screen, but it's all good
on Facebook.
Okay. Welcome to this final of a 3-part series on pay parity and the ECE funding system. This is a wrap up of 2 earlier sessions that you might have missed. So the first one was on pay parity. And that was important for us because we've got a lot of our centres around the country suffering from a pay parity funding gap. And as a result, they're increasing fees and closing. And so we really wanted parents to know that that was happening. And that was pretty much the reason for doing these sessions at the start. But of course, whilst we were planning this, the budget came out as well. And there were some pretty major changes for 20 hours ECE, which is the #1 funding support that parents receive from the government. And that led to quite a lot of media comment. So we thought the second of our webinars covers 20 hours. But anyway, let's get started. Next slide, please. So my name is Simon Laube. I'm the Chief Executive of the Early Childhood Council, and joining me on the webinar tonight is Rachel Laube from my office. So Rachel's actually not a parent. She's one of my staff members, but Rachel controls our marketing communication side in our back office. And she has put together all the questions that we've received from parents, and we've pulled together other questions too that have come up. And so it's really great to have Rachel supporting me on tonight's webinar, and that'll make it less of a Simon monologue. Rachel, would you like to say a few words?
Kia ora everyone. I'm really excited to be presenting here today with Simon. Like he said, I'm not a parent, but my knowledge of the policy and EC funding system is quite minimal. It's just what I hear throughout the office. So I think I'll bring a pretty similar perspective with similar knowledge to you guys.
Thanks, Rachel. Yeah, it is good. So can we go back one slide? Sorry, I just want to around the Early Childhood Council, we are the largest early childhood incorporated society in New Zealand for early childhood providers. We've got members that range from big extremes. So we've got some of the large groups that you hear about. We've also got about 84% of our membership are single kind of owner-operator organisations. And about a third of our members are community-based providers. So they could be charities, they're anything really. That is the great thing about early childhood. It is so diverse, and that's one of the strengths of the way we've set up early childhood in New Zealand, is it has this diversity as a strength. It's not all one size fits all. It's very much, local, your community. So even a private and a community-based provider, we would say don't use that as a way of thinking about your centre, because who owns it is kind of irrelevant, because both ownership structures can choose the same settings. It's really up to them. So yeah, how big is it? We've got 845 members, about nearly 1,400 centres, employing nearly 10,000 staff. Of those, nearly 6,500 are qualified teachers, and about 75,000 children each year going through. And our main role is really around trying to improve the standard of early childhood. That is not a top priority at the moment, because actually that second one has become a real focus, which is just making sure our members can continue to survive, because it doesn't really matter what the quality is if you don't exist anymore. So that's really taken over at the moment, but it's not going to be that way forever, but it is that way right now. And of course, the last one is around kind of advocating for issues for our sector to government. But actually, is it really just government? No, it's not just government. Parents are critically important. You guys choose the services for your children, and you are a major funder for the services. So it's really important that you have opportunities like this to take part in what's going on. Thanks, Rachel. So just a quick wrap up of what we've done. So video 1 on our Facebook has the funding system overview. If you're a real glutton for complexity, have a look at that. And can't really apologize enough just how complicated it is. If you find it so mind-numbingly difficult, just imagine how hard it is to run a business or a not-for-profit community-based organization with those rules, okay? It's not particularly easy, not easy at all. In that first session, we also talk about pay parity. And then in the second session, we talk about consultation on a new funding system, and we get into the 20 hours changes in budget. And this session is a wrap up, so you don't need to have watched any of those. We'll kind of cover the key points in this one. Thanks, Rachel. This is a good kind of anchoring. Yeah.
1 second. Sorry, one moment.
All right.
We thought we had it. I'll just head back to the slides. Oh. So
okay,
we'll
yeah, over to you, Rachel, on questions.
We'll get on to the questions that we answered. There are about 8 or 9 of them that were pre-submitted. We saw some really common themes arising within the questions. As we go through them, feel free to leave your own questions in the chat. I will be monitoring what we see, and then we'll add it to the end of the session. Cool. So the first question we had: how can parents afford to keep their children in ECE with the current state of the economy? Both parents must be working to afford basic necessities, and then there is no one else to look after our children.
Okay, so this is the format. So Rachel asks the question, then I attempt to answer. So this one is complex, obviously, but I think the first thing we'd say is remember the benefits to your children of quality ECE participation. You can rely on that. We are a heavily regulated sector, low quality providers. You hear about them all the time, but they're few and far between, and they get rooted out pretty effectively. So you should be able to rely on good quality ECE if you send your children there. Fact is, though, many parents are not. We know that already. Working from home and caring for your children, that's not a quality experience for your children, and it's difficult for you too. I know that is a good way of, with your household income, making things work, but the one who's missing out is they're the children. And that's not your fault at all, not at all. That's what these sessions are about, just letting you know that this is a problem facing everyone, not just you. And partly this is an area where we would suggest that government needs to play a stronger role, and we'll come to that a little bit more. So whether or not you can afford early childhood education is becoming difficult for many, not just you. National and Labour have both tried to make a play for this vote, your vote, and we'll talk about what their different offerings are in a bit more detail later. In the meantime, though, what can you do? So in the next 7 months, the pressure is going to get worse on families to pay more in early childhood. It's not going to be relaxed at all, because costs are going up, the services, they're ratcheting up big time. So one thing you can do, though, is you can let your service know, or your centre, your whatever it's called, a kindergarten, whatever it is, just let them know how you are going in terms of your ability to even pay the current fees. This is really valuable information if you are in that, if you're in the business owner's point of view, because if they know that parents can't afford to pay more, they're going to be a lot less likely to seek to increase fees. And I'll talk about that a bit more in a minute. Next question, please, Rachel.
Cool. So the next one is to do with 20 hours. What are the negative effects or other consequences from the extension of the 20 hours ECE policy to include under twos, so children under 2? So this one we kind of had come from a range of different questions. The first being, will 20 hours free ECE push out more experienced teachers as centres look to cut costs for viability?
Yeah, that's a good question, and we're still getting it now, even from our own members. But the answer is quite a good one, which is no, not after the back down from the government. So the government did talk about putting in a rule that would force the providers to give parents the option of just having the 20 hours free. Now, if that was to happen, the providers wouldn't be able to cover the costs, the additional costs that the government's not funding for those 20 hours. And so with the background now, back down, it means that there is no risk of these experienced teachers being pushed out, because that would be one of the best ways of saving your costs if you're the service. If you can't afford 20 hours anymore, you'll get rid of the most experienced teachers because they will cost you more. You will also get rid of teachers that you do not need because you're not funded for them. And if they're not funding you and they stop you from being able to charge fees to cover that salary cost, what choice have you got left? You've got to get rid of the teacher. So a very, very good back down there from the government. So very, very welcome, I think, for everyone. That does leave us wondering, doesn't it, about 20 hours and whether or not it's really a workable scheme.
Yeah, definitely good news about the back down. The second question being, do we need to change session times in order to adapt to 20 hours free?
Well, it's not going to be too complicated, but there is a bit of complexity to it. So services are already doing 20 hours for the 3-year-olds, 4-year-olds, and some 5-year-olds. It's working really well from a service point of view. So extending it to 2-year-olds, all that means is that you have more children attending for longer that you will need to deliver services to. So in your mind, probably the best way to think about it is the service is going to need more teachers, because the teachers they've got there right now are already delivering the required service to the 3-year-olds plus. So any new hours delivered will take more teacher time that isn't already there. So of course, some of the existing teachers can work more hours. That's one option, but that's not going to stretch it, okay? So we do have a teacher shortage in New Zealand, so it will take quite a lot of time for services to build up their provision to be able to reach a lot of 2-year-olds, but it will come because funding from the government is a big incentive for the services to do what's required.
Yeah, that's great. So there will be a little bit of wait list for children under 2, but they will get there eventually.
Yeah, Rachel, in the meantime, we'll see longer wait lists actually, because you'll have all those 2-year-olds wanting, all the parents with 2-year-olds who want to get a place will start to think now's the time, but actually it will take time for the provision to build. And that time starts next year, not now.
Is there an operating model which will allow centres to maintain 100% ratio of qualified teachers on the floor?
Yeah, this is a funny question because it's hard to quite understand the point of the question, but with 20 hours, what's built into 20 hours is a minimum ratio of teachers. And the problem is that many providers exceed that minimum, but they're still funded to the minimum, but they're exceeding it. So if you take quite a common number that we have around centres, so 50 is quite a common size of a centre, so 50 children, and we're assuming all these children are 3-year-olds, so they're 20 hours children. That service must have a minimum of 5 teachers for the 50 children, because that is the ratio of 1 to 10. But that doesn't happen, and you can't make that work. Because you can't have staff to that absolute level. You've always got to have more staff than the minimum. Otherwise, you're going to go over the minimum during lunch breaks, or something happens, but you haven't met it. So then, okay, so you know that they don't have 5 teachers. That service with 50 children doesn't have 5 teachers. They have more than 5 teachers. That 6th teacher is not funded by the government. So they're always going to be funded by parents. The 6th teacher could be unqualified, and they would still be funded at 100% qualified teachers, because for the 5 teachers that they had to have, all 5 of them were qualified, and it doesn't matter what the 6th one was. Could be qualified or it could be unqualified, but doesn't get counted by the government. That's why government doesn't really know what's going on, because they only really care about what the minimum is. And we've moved on from the minimum a long time ago, based in a large part by services' own commitment to quality, but also parents wanting the best for their children. So they choose services with better quality options, and that's where their fees are going, making that happen.
Good explanation. Next one, will the results of the general election in October have any effect on childcare costs?
Okay, so trying to keep this really simple. If Labour end up in a government post-October, then you'll have the 20 hours extension to 2-year-olds. If National are elected, then they're not committed to that policy. You would have the Family Boost childcare rebate. That's the National offering. It's either or, it's not both at the same time. That's the current situation. Okay, we'll try and go through this table kind of quickly. So in the red, we've got the Labour option, which is the extension to 20 hours. And in the blue is the National option, the childcare subsidy. And I'll just try and go through some of the key differences in the policy. So for a start, for Labour's one, the 20 hours, it is beneficial for the 2-year-olds that are already in the centres, so from next year, in March next year, but there won't be that many more 2-year-old places until the provision changes, but it will change in the future. It is a big deal for the sector. It is a very decent policy. On the other hand, with the National one, that is a tax rebate. So it's not an extension to an existing education policy. It is based on your household. In the first category, it is on how much annual income the household has. So if your combined income as a family is 170,000 up to 170,000, that's the cutoff, and then you'd get the minimum amount of rebate, which is just under, $19 a week, so $18.75 a week. However, there's a kind of second level to this too. You've got to actually be paying fees to get a rebate, and so there's another threshold around how many fees you're paying, how much fees you're paying per week. So that family who's on 170,000, they could potentially get $18.75 a week as a rebate, paid every fortnight. But if they're not paying at least $100 in childcare costs, they'll get nothing, because there is no threshold for that. So you do have to, it's a rebate on your childcare fees. So you, for a start, you do need to have some childcare fees to get the rebate. Then it's kind of income tested. That would be the easy way to think about it. So the national one is kind of quite confusing with these different thresholds. But I think the real point is that the maximum you could possibly save under the childcare rebate is only $75 per week per household, not per child. And whereas the 20 hours extension to 2-year-olds, for the families that have 2-year-olds, you'd save up to $133 per week. So, you know, not everyone has 2-year-olds, only 2 for a year, you know. So it's hard to compare these things. 2-year-old for a year, then you get 20 hours anyway. And then the national one applies to all ages. So, you know, you make up your own mind. But okay, next page, there's a bit more to this one too.
Yeah, just consider your own position.
So how does it help families? So the Labour one, what it will do, which is why the sector's quite keen on the Labour one, is that it will stimulate new service provision. Because of course, our services and our members will need to hire more teachers to deliver all these hours to all these 2-year-olds, just like we see with 20 hours now for the other age groups. So quite a big impact from a service delivery point of view. You know, from what does that mean to you? It means you go, you enroll, you actually get a place, you're not waiting forever. So that's quite a good thing, we would say. On the other hand, the national one, actually, it's quite broad. So, you know, everyone with a child in ECE, nearly, you know, 80% of households with a child under 5 will be eligible. That's a lot of eligibility. So it goes very broad, but quite slight, you know. It's hard to see how the national one will have the same impact on the level of provision. You know, how does that play out across all the services now? Because that's a lot of households, but what kind of change does that mean across services, you know? So if you've got a service with 20 children, what does it mean? Are they going to get 1 more child, or will 5 children do 2 more hours? It's quite hard from our side to work out what the benefit would be, but the Labour one is much stronger. So then how does it help services? So thinking about it not from the family lens, but from the service side, we've got an issue in Auckland. We've got not every service, but a lot of services are experiencing quite low demand. So both of these initiatives can stimulate that demand, because parents will see that, hold on a minute, it's going to become a whole lot more cost effective to use ECE. So hopefully in Auckland, what we'll see is a lot of parents coming back into ECE that are currently put off by you guys having such a long lockdown in Auckland. So I think I've covered the weakness of the Family Boost one. Yep, I have. Next slide, please.
Cool. So the next question we have is, what are the average childcare fees in my area? And we got this question from people all the way up in Northland down to people in Dunedin.
And I'm afraid, you know, a real weasel over here, can't tell you what the answer is, but your best option is to identify the services in your area that you're interested in and ask each one for a copy of their fee schedules and an indication of when a place may be available for your child. And bear in mind, they're going to ask how old your child is. And you know, from what we've already told you, that the age of your child is actually really important, because when the children turn 3, they get 20 hours, so they'll get government funding support. That's not a coincidence, you know. That's why the extension to 2-year-olds is so important, because you should see places become available for 2-year-olds a lot more with that policy. So how much would you likely be paying? So weekly fees can range all over the place, from about $300 per week to 0. But a word of caution, it really does depend. Like you get what you pay for. So those higher fees are paying for something. Don't assume it's all profit. You know, higher weekly bills for parents mean you're using, first obvious one, a lot more hours than the 20 hours that are covered by funding. And the other thing is, and this is a bit harder for you to spot, you may have many more teachers than the minimums. And that's why the service is needing to recover a lot more teacher costs. Next slide, please.
Next question. How do we know we are paying the correct fees for optional charges? What can we do if we believe our centre is not complying with the conditions and enforcing compulsory charges on us? So just a recap on optional charges that we did in the last webinar.
Thanks, Rachel. Yeah, so an optional charge, it's a request that's got to be made in writing to you for a payment. Then you need to be able to choose whether or not you're going to accept it or not. When I say in writing, the most common way you'll see it would be in your enrolment agreement. And when we're talking about optional charges, we're only talking about 20 hours ECE, not the other funding sources that don't have this rule. But that optional charge could cover quite a lot of things, actually. It could be for the education and care of the child, i.e. the service that your child is there for. But it would have to be above, if you're going to have an optional charge for the service, the basic service, then that service must be above the minimum regulated levels. And it still needs to be able to be separated out and measured, because otherwise how could it be optional if it cannot be separated out? Then how can you choose not to have it? So those are the rules, the three kind of clear rules around optional charges from what you should be looking for. And here's some examples of things that it could cover, like sunscreen, lotion and clothing items, hats, common for excursions, entrance fees, transport, food, teaching resources. You should never see the word compulsory around an optional charge, because it can't be compulsory, can it? Because it must be optional. So that would be a really big warning sign if you saw that word. Unacceptable optional charges, things that are required under legislation. Anything general contributions, you see, because a general contribution would fail that separated out test. Someone charging a fee because the service is well regarded, that's not an acceptable optional charge. Home management, in the case of ECE provided in the child's own home, so home-based. Wage administration, wage top-ups, so we're talking about teacher top-ups. Administration, like an administration charge for 20 hours ECE. And excursions that don't meet the criteria for excursions and transport, i.e. they're not really excursions. They shouldn't really have happened in the first place, so you can't be charged for them. Next slide, please.
Oh, why does it do this? Sorry.
So gone to the end again.
Yeah.
Ooh. Okay, over to you, Rachel.
Is your answer? So that's the same question. We're just asking what parents can do if they believe that they're being forced to pay charges that are compulsory and not optional.
Yeah, so our view on this one is do not complain to the Ministry of Education in the first instance. If you have a concern about a fee or a fee schedule, you should first make a request to the service, or a complaint if you feel like it's a complaint. Do it directly to the service, and they must have a complaints process. Use that in the first instance. If you don't know what it is, you should be able to see it when you go into the service. The complaints process must be prominently displayed. It's a regulatory requirement. In addition, a parent has the right to request information about fees charged by the service. The service must provide that information to you in writing. This means you have a legal right to the fee information, and they have a duty to provide it. If that process doesn't happen for you, you can make a complaint to the service again. So do that in the first instance. What we're saying is ask them first. They should tell you. If you're not satisfied, complain to them. After you've complained to them, if you're still not satisfied, you could consider complaining to the ministry. But the reason why we've said don't go to the ministry first is because what we're seeing at the moment is a lot of complaints leading to basically the closure of services by the ministry, because their only option is to deal with the license of that service. And the license, unfortunately, is the ability to run the service full stop. So they don't have any other options. There's no fines, there's no warnings. It is, you did not follow the regulations, so you will have a licensing sanction. And I'm afraid to say it just is leading, at the moment, that behavior by the ministry is just leading to lots of services closing. And we don't think that's smart. We think that, well, we know that our members and our providers, they want to provide the quality, they want to follow the regulations, and for the most part, they just, you know, if they don't comply, it's because they didn't understand. That's why it's so important for you to raise it with them. But we believe that there should be someone trying to build the capability of these providers so they get better, don't take a punishment approach, because we don't want to lose the services. Actually, why not just improve what we've got? Next slide, please, Rachel.
Next question. Can you provide an update on the Ministry of Education funding review that was mentioned in the past 2 webinars?
Yeah, so we do have a little bit of a scoop for you tonight. So we did hear from the ministry, and the details are still confidential. They haven't been approved by the minister for public release. But I can tell you that it was quite clear that the consultation was overwhelmingly negative. So there is no current appetite to progress with what was proposed in that funding review. But then similarly, we don't really know what's proposed instead. Thank you for any parents who put in submissions. We put out some support for parents to make submissions, and I think we were unsure about whether or not it was a good use of people's time putting in a submission when it was such a bad proposal. But thank you so much for doing it. I think it has made a really big difference. Thank you so much. We're currently calling for a fresh funding review. The reason why the one that has just been consulted on was a fail was because the scope was all wrong. If you start with the wrong premise, you can't arrive at a good conclusion. And the general idea with the funding review was that you could take all of the current funding that parents receive through the government, and you could reallocate it so that it would pay for the pay parity policy that the government's trying to implement. So that pay parity is about paying teachers more. Problem is, you can't, if you do that, then you achieve pay parity, but at what expense? Unfortunately, the expense of a lot of services, because you're not giving them more money to pay for the new thing, you're just taking money they had for other things to pay for the new thing. So then they fail because of the other thing. That's probably a confusing way of saying it, but yeah. Next slide, please, Rachel.
How can we understand the financial situation of our centres when their profits are not made public?
Yeah, another like a big kind of discussion point this year, and maybe for a while until we get to the bottom of it. But I think what we would say is that, you know, the way it's set up in New Zealand with government funding and regulation, deep down what that's done is it's built a system of competition where it means that, you know, where you send your child determines where the money goes from the government. So that's the kind of competitive angle. So each service is has to be smart to that, so that there's a disincentive for a service to raise a fee that is out of whack with what other services are doing. Because if they do that, you know, you guys will find out and you'll move your children from one service to another. You know, that's what that means. But you know, that's not quite how it is, because you see you've got so little choice now and your fees are so high, so something must be going wrong, and you'd be right. New providers are not establishing because the government has pretty much iced that. So you don't see new services popping up, quite the opposite. You see them closing down. So that's why it's so hard for us to argue about why you shouldn't be making profits public, because it's quite a hard thing for us to talk about, because we're focused on trying to keep our providers from going under, and yet we need to defend those who are making profits. And that's not the problem we're currently seeing in the sector. We're losing our providers because they can't remain viable. Now, I do need to remind you that like focusing on profit is quite narrow. If you've got providers making a profit, the way you would be able to spot them would be that they would have really full centres, because only when you have a centre running at its capacity should it really make any profit, because otherwise you'll have maybe more teachers than you should compared to your children, and so you won't make any profit. It just won't work. And centres that are too expensive for families, like if you raise your fees too much, you will start to lose your families. Everyone knows that. They'll move to another centre, or they'll stop going to ECE entirely. So that also affects the profit margins in the centres. That's very real. And let's remember also that it's not actually all about profit anyway, because there are lots of providers that are community-based that are deliberately set up not to make a profit. Well, both of these models are running under the same system, and we've got community-based providers failing too. In fact, they're failing even worse because they can't get your parent fees as much as the private ones do. So they can't cost recover the underfunding. And community-based providers, they are sharing all of their financial reports publicly through the charity's website. So if you are at a service that is a charity, you can find that yourself by going online. It's not that hard. And they should do, because they're charities, so that's a different status. But for a normal business, especially if you're in a competitive market, why would you expect that information to be made public? It's quite unrealistic to do that. In the last 7 years, we have OIA'd IRD, and we know that more than half of the private providers have made zero surplus, so they had no taxable income to pay tax on. They weren't making a profit. So, the profit question is pretty gnarly. I don't think we've got anything kind of resoundingly final for you tonight, but I think, does make you wonder what is the problem. I think we know what the problem is the high cost of childcare and the bad access. We know those are the problems. Profits, I'm not sure where did people get that problem from, but it's an interesting one, I'll give you that.
And the last one, how can we support our centre to keep them financially viable?
Well, like I've said in previous sessions, you understanding the situation makes you part of the solution. If you feel strongly about what we've been talking about, for now, we didn't have a motive. We were simply trying to educate parents about what's going on because we knew you'd want to know. And I suppose it is an election year, so now's the time to pay attention. We're not asking you to do something. If anything, sign up to our email list that Rachel's going to put up in a minute, and we'll send you communications if there's something we suggest that you do. But at this stage, if you feel really passionately and you got on this webinar because you actually want to make a difference, you can make a difference. You can email MPs. This is amazing, Rachel. What is it doing now?
I don't know.
Yeah. But you can email your local MP, find out who it is. You could do both Labour and National, and just let them know how you feel. And I think in our notes, I think we said, we're not going to provide like a template, because government is quite cynical. If they see templates come through, they just kind of categorize them as one response, and all of you get counted as one. So just a very brief line or two, genuine messages to the MPs about, what it means to you and what would make a big difference to you. And I think it is really important in our democracy that we do feel that we can do that. It is one of the pillars of the democracy that you're supposed to have that kind of access to your government. So use it. It's there. You can use it. It does make a difference. Let them know what you think should happen.
I don't think I see any questions in the chat at all. So just a reminder, if you do have any questions, just remember to nut them in now. I think we can move on to the next slide, which is what other initiatives we're taking to help centres.
Yeah, so we covered this in the last session as well. So ECC is going to announce our policy manifesto end of this week, and that's some ideas that we are hoping that parties will pick up, both National and Labour. We're apolitical. We don't subscribe to a particular party, but we want to have a piece of the action too. We want to put some good ideas out there, and we don't think politicians are going to just naturally come up with good ideas on their own. Like, we do need to kind of help them. It doesn't mean all of our ideas are right as well, but our manifesto outlines some things that we think will make a big difference to early childhood for everybody. But it's all about the children, really. Like, we are all just custodians. We are representing some of the service providers, and you are trusting us to deliver services to them. So, we all have a stake in this. Other things going on, there's a fair pay agreement for early childhood. ECC's recently been approved as one of the employer bargaining parties, so we'll be representing many of our members in that process. That's quite bad timing, considering there's an election coming up, so it's quite a headache for everybody. Not sure whether or not that legislation would survive a change in government, which is also quite sad for us because we're spending the time now anyway, regardless. And parent survey, I think we do send those out from time to time. I'm not sure if we've got one currently live, Rachel, do we?
Yep, I'm just linking it in the chat now.
Oh, fantastic. Okay. So I think next slide.
Oh my God, why is it keep doing this? Sorry, our presentation is just too enjoyable for our system. It just keeps celebrating on us.
Wow, glad I wouldn't be able to pull off the drum roll, but I didn't get any drum noises. Okay, so will they be able to click these links when we send out the presentation?
Yeah, in the presentation they'll be available.
So there's a few things there. We did issue a press release last week, I think it was, or late the week before, around the secondary teacher announcement. So you would have seen the secondary school teachers have settled, and that will kind of cascade down to primary and kindergarten. Well, it doesn't include us. Okay, so the largest part of the early childhood sector is currently left high and dry. So, I was complaining about pay parity before and how we're not funded to pay our teachers enough, and you guys end up paying for that difference. Well, the gap just got wider, unfortunately, for teachers in our sector. But of course, we're putting a lot of pressure on government to really, they've got this pay parity commitment, so they need to make good on that commitment. I think we're done, aren't we, Rachel?
Yeah.
Okay, well, thank you so much. And thank you, Rachel. I really appreciated having your support tonight. That made a really big difference to me. So thanks so much.
No problem. Just had to bring the whole fiesta with me, I guess.
Yeah. And for you at home, thanks for tuning in. I hope you haven't missed too much of the football. It should be starting in a couple of minutes for those of you who can afford Sky. Not me. Okay. Thanks, guys. Economy. Good evening. Thanks for tuning in.